got a couple more clues from listening to Steve Pavlina, Day 20. And he was talking today about our relationship with the simulator, in quotes. So he calls reality the simulator sometimes. And what he was talking about, without going too much into how he uses his terminology, because that's not the point I'm trying to make. The point I'm trying to make is taking some of the clues that he gave me that weren't about me, but I'm making them about me, because I can create my own meaning. So he was talking about how he developed the skill of lucid dreaming. I don't have this skill that I know of. And lucid dreaming is where one can learn to realize one's dreaming and then not wake up and control the dream. So one could be dreaming something and then realize, oh, I'm dreaming, so I'm going to fly, or I'm going to climb up this tree, or whatever. So it's like controlling the dream, which is lucid dreaming. And the first thing I want to say about that is, in so-called mania, in a way we realize life is like a dream, or life seems more like a dream, or happens more like a dream, because things happen in a meaningful way, and they happen in ways that are beyond belief. Like one could be thinking about a person, for example, and then they show up in mania, not in a dream, but in one's real life experience. So it's almost like we realize we're dreaming so we can control the dream to some extent. But I don't think that we're the controller. I think the universe is the controller. So what I'm trying to say is, in mania, the world is kind of dream-like. Things can happen magically and synchronistically and in unbelievable ways, kind of like a dream. And I think what can happen is, in mania, is there is a sort of dreaming while awake algorithm in the brain. So there's lucid dreaming, where one becomes consciously aware one is dreaming and then controls the dream. And I think what happens in mania is that the person, whether they know it or not, has been woken up from the dream of objectivity, and one is more in contact with subjectivity, like a dreamer would be. But I don't know if we are usually aware of this. It just sort of changes and is kind of magical, and we're like, this is strange. But I think that which realizes it, that which wakes up, is something more universal. So it could be a universal human consciousness. It's not that a self or a thought is aware that one is dreaming. Like the self is this structure of thinking, and in order to wake up while awake, that self structure needs to actually dissipate, because that self structure is that actually which is wasting our energy in lower energetic states of the brain, because it's repetitive. So all of a sudden now we're in this really awake state where nothing feels like repetition. Everything feels so new. We're looking at something as if it's for the first time. And in a way, that's because we're not looking through thought. We're not looking through the lens of the thought of self. We're just looking. So there's something totally different. We think of ourselves as this self, but when that's gone, something else is looking. And that something else feels like, wow, I'm looking for the first time at all this. It's so beautiful, because it's not looking through the lens of thought. And this is an awakeness within our brain that has nothing to do with thought. So what I'm trying to say is, there's a bit of a trap in this, because there's no self to be self-conscious of this. and be like, oh, look, I'm awake now. No, that's not the way it works. There's an awakening, but there's nobody there that's awakened. The somebody that thinks it's there is thinking the thought structure. And that lens of looking through the thought structure and looking through our own projections, looking through our own memories, stops. And that's why everything looks so fresh, because we're not looking through the past. We're looking at the now. And so that which looks is not thought, and that which is the conglomeration of thought is the self. So there's nothing to be conscious of being awake. So in a way, when we start to awaken, we don't even know. We don't even know that we were sleeping, and we don't know that looking through the lens of thought was technically sleepwalking. And now we're awake. We're looking at everything for the first time, and everything looks so beautiful, because it really is. Thought tells us it's all mediocre and mundane and boring and repetitive, because that's what thought is. So I'm trying to point out that being awake, awakening, is kind of like dreaming, because everything feels like one consciousness, because there isn't a separation of I'm the thinker looking, I'm the self looking at the world. It's the world looking at itself, and it's just one thing. So the duality is gone. So when the duality is gone, who is the one to know that the duality is gone? There's nobody there to know. So that's part of the trouble of it. Whereas lucid dreaming is a bit the opposite. It's like, oh wow, I know I'm dreaming and now I can do anything. But it's not really that way when we wake up, when we're awake. We didn't know we were sleepwalking. And then we don't know that we're awake, because the sleepwalking is the self, and then when it's gone, it doesn't even really know that it's gone. So the thing that's similar about lucid dreaming and the state of mania, which is being really awake, being awake and dreaming versus being asleep and knowing one's dreaming, so being conscious of the dream and lucid dreaming, the similarity is that since it works a bit like a dream, like the dream stuff is the same as the dreamer, when we're awake, the material world is the same stuff as the dreamer of the material world. And the similar thing is that when that happens, we might start thinking that life works like a dream where we can literally fly. Some people might think they can fly in mania because life seems like a dream, and the way that it's like a dream is there's no duality between any of it. It's all one substance. All material is all of consciousness, and the material is actually alive, like a dream. It's not this static thing. So that's why sometimes we begin to test reality in a lot of different ways. And the thing is, when we are awake, we are subject to some of the physical laws, but we're just not sure which ones, because things happen. When one is wide awake, the material world responds differently. It does respond more like a dream. It responds in a sort of quantum physics type way, as opposed to a Newtonian way. And one sees that other things are possible than what we thought. And then something else he said that was interesting about when he was learning how to lucid dream was that he said at first he would only be able to lucid dream for a few seconds, because as soon as he realized that he was asleep and dreaming, he'd get a bit excited and his heart would pound and he'd wake up. So he had to learn to not get all excited like this, to be able to stay in that lucid dreaming state. And I sort of now see that as So he realizes he's dreaming, his heart pounds, and he wakes up. Well, for some reason, when I have the positive energy, which is moving more in like a higher brain energy state, which then allows the material world to respond differently to my brain and consciousness. It responds more as one thing. What often happens, because I do spend some time reading and studying, is that I have an insight and I write it down, and then I pick up a book and it's there. So it happens in the other way. It's not like I read something and write it down. It comes to mind, and then I'll just pick up a random book and it'll be there. Or look at an email and they'll be saying what just came to mind. Just like how I was talking about, my brain cells talking, and then watching that video and it's saying that cells understand English. So not exactly the same thing, but it really was an external prover to what came to mind in my brain. So the material world is responding. A DVD is responding to what came to my mind and what I said to myself. So in that way, it's happening. Something comes into consciousness, then like the next thing I listen to or watch says the same thing that I just said originally to myself. So it's, in my way, it's like the universe saying yes to me. It's like my brain cells are talking about themselves, and then I watch something and it kind of confirms. So I could go and do all the scientific studies, or I could be like, wow, the universe just showed me the same thing after it came to mind. Not that I thought it. So, back to the lucid dreaming, he's saying that when he realizes that he's dreaming, at first he got excited and his heart pounds, and that wakes him up. And I realized that when I get to the end of this extra energy after 5 months, I usually have trouble sleeping. And what happens is I'm trying to sleep and my heart pounds and wakes me up. And so it's happening in sort of an opposite way. It's happening almost like the whole 5 months was kind of more like the lucid dream, which I'm saying in the level of waking reality is being extra awake, and that makes reality respond more like a dream, not that it is a dream, but more like a dream as in it's one field of consciousness that is alive. The whole field is living, just like in dreaming. So what I'm saying is, it could be that at the end of that 5 months, it's like I can't sleep and my heart pounds and wakes me up because I'm sort of going back down into the lower level of reality, which is where the brain perceives more in an objective way. And I've been able to transcend that heart pounding, waking me up. It's almost like the heart is resisting going back into objective perception mode. In the lower energy state, it doesn't want to. And so my heart pounds and kind of wants to reawaken me to stay in the awake state, because I'm about to sort of go through this wormhole into a different energetic brain state, which is more like objectivity, like how everyone kind of is. And the last couple times that's happened, I've managed to stay out of the hospital, but it was very challenging. Last time I got through it pretty easy. The time before was awful. And the time before wasn't too bad. But each time that I've had these crisis events, the crisis is usually my heart pounding, just as Steve described it in a different context of learning how to lucid dream. And so I'm seeing it as the opposite. My body's resisting coming out of being wide awake and being sort of one consciousness with reality, which the first time it happened in my 1 month of mania, it felt so magical and wonderful. But now I feel like my brain's used to it. It doesn't feel so magical. Like each time I don't think, oh, I can fly. The first time I might have thought I could fly and walk through walls, but I couldn't. And so I learned. And the next time it comes along, I don't test that again, because I learned last time that's not the way it works. So there's a learning that can happen in that state over time. And if it doesn't happen, well, that's not very intelligent. So what I'm saying too is when those crisis events happened and I was re-hospitalized, like my heart would pound, I would be afraid. It's like my brain is afraid to go back into perceiving the world as a separate object, as objects against objects, as being a Newtonian brain. And what's the psych system there for? It's to be like, oh, it's okay to be yourself and you're going to recover, blah, blah, blah. We're going to medicate you to help lower the energy of your brain, because it seems like the brain is resisting lowering the energy, and part of the fear happens because we just don't have the nutrients and the capacity to keep accelerating in that way. And it might not necessarily be bad. It's probably good to be able to accelerate. The deceleration kind of sucks, but I think it's better to be able to do that than to be stuck on a treadmill, an energetic brain treadmill. That would be awful. So what I'm trying to say is the first 3 times I had a crisis, I ended up re-hospitalized. And, you know, it seems interesting how reality plays out. When I was re-hospitalized and, you know, I was in these good states of mind, and then I have this crisis. And what I'm saying is my brain's trying to resist going back to seeing objectively, seeing through thoughts. The brain's resisting having the self-structure, the conditioned self-structure come back online. And since I wasn't able to go through that by myself at the time, I feel like part of the clue that this could be part of what's happening is that when I was hospitalized in that crisis of, you know, resisting going through that like dimensional portal, that brain portal, the psych system is there to objectify me. So if I don't learn how to go from subjective consciousness, which is kind of like mania, being wide awake, well awake, which is why it's hard to sleep sometimes, because we're so awake and we're sped up. So we have more energy in our brain. It's harder for the brain to calm down and go to sleep. And also, the brain is wide awake, and the next level down is actually sleepwalking, awake. You know, sleeping while walking around, supposedly awake. So if one's in the energetic state, it can be harder to sleep because one has to literally go through, like, the brain sees being awake based on thought as sleeping. So it's almost like you are sleeping, but you're not. So it's hard to get past that level and go to sleep, what was sleep before. So what I'm trying to say is, if I can learn to get through this deceleration, this lowering of the energy of the brain, which makes it go from a subjective, energized, wide awake, creative perception, perceiving meaning everywhere, moving according to it, and life is pretty fun that way because it feels full of meaning, subjective meaning, to the brain moving based on objective meaning of being told what things mean. Like, life is about this and this and this, and, you know, it's all sort of cut and dry, and, like, follow these projections and you'll be happy, which isn't happiness. So the brain's doing that thing, and our behaviors are such that often we're afraid of this process, and since we're afraid of it, we end up getting captured by psychiatry and being objectified, when really we need to learn how to go between subjective and objective consciousness. And then we don't need to be objectified by a medical profession if we can learn to go between those different states without it being noticed by a medical system and turned into a medical problem. It's not necessarily a medical problem. And I still do use psych meds right now to fall asleep. which I'm pretty grateful for because it slows down my brain enough to be able to sleep. And if I can sleep enough, less hours in the day that I'm awake, the less hours I have to accelerate. And the last point, I can make one point or talk about one little thing and it goes on for like 25 minutes. Steve was talking about how, at first when he learned to lucid dream, it was like a few seconds, and then longer, and then longer. And then eventually he realized, hey, this is a skill set, because if I'm lucid dreaming, I need to learn how to climb up this tree in a lucid dream, or I need to learn how to fly in a lucid dream. Or so there were certain constraints. It's not like, oh, I'm lucid dreaming and I can have anything I want in the dream, even though it was lucid. So he's saying this could mean that there's certain constraints on objective reality too. Just because we get into an abundant consciousness doesn't mean everything is just going to be on our plate that we've ever wanted. There's still a skill to going about doing what we want. And so I think this could be something that is important for so-called mania too. And I think there is a skill in it. I feel like what's happening is we need to learn how to do things with that type of subjective consciousness. And one thing we don't necessarily realize when we first go into it is that other people are probably an objective consciousness. And our subjective meaning that we're seeing can subtly affect them. But if we try to force that on them, they will probably, there'll be an energetic retaliation. I feel that if we provoke the reflex of thought in other people, then it's like the Newtonian billiard ball effect. So we might think we're doing something good, but it's going to come back at us. And that could be part of what messes up the energy of it. And I think that creating our own understanding, if I've gotten to myself to the point where understanding that doing too much in that state actually isn't necessarily a good thing, it might feel good for me personally, but to take it as something that is personally pleasurable might be a mistake. It might be part of what recoalesces the self as thinking of itself as a separate person by making it a personally pleasurable thing. I don't know, but the thing too, I think when we first go into mania is that we get into a celebratory state of consciousness. We celebrate. And if we're happy and celebrating, woo, and people notice that, they're kind of why are you celebrating? There's nothing to be that happy about in this moment. So they're kind of putting energy back at us. So I think we got to keep our celebration to ourselves, unless we create some kind of mania festival where we can all be happy for no reason, without causality, without cause. And I do think that a model where the universe is trying to wake us up from sleepwalking as repetitive thoughts and reflexes of thoughts, we're really not free. We're marionetted by these thoughts, and when that energy comes in, we're free from that to some extent. So part of the action could be not acting based on our pre-conditioned ways, because the energy can come in and actually augment the ways of our thinking action reflexes, which only energizes equal and opposite thought force back against us. So that's pretty long-winded, and This is another funny one that he mentioned based on the simulator that relates to something that I've already said to myself. He was talking about an example of kind of a weird example. He was saying a 10-hour flight to another city could literally be the time that the simulator needs to render a new city. So bring up the programming from a new city, and then we get there and we're tired from jet lag, and then we need to sleep, which gives the simulator more time to process and build the scenes of the city. So he's literally talking about a flight represents the time of the simulator needing to create the new city versus, literally objectively flying from one city to another. And that could be seen as really impossible, but I saw a very similarity with what I talked about in terms of how in so-called mania it seems like one speeds up and thinks of all these thoughts and almost goes into future consciousness, like the future higher energy processing of the brain, with more energy going into different areas of the brain, different algorithm altogether. So one's like flying into different brain speeds. The brain is literally taking off for X amount of time. And now when one does that, most other people's brains around is just like walking, So a person in mania is like taking off in flight, flying to the future, and then people are like walking to that same city. And so what happens is a person in mania sort of at some point decelerates, slows down. The brain loses energy, and one has like a come down effect, like being high, but one wasn't taking anything. So one was like high, and now one's having the come down effect, and it's awful. And I said to myself that could actually be like reality needing to catch up, like slowing down and waiting for the others to walk there in the the ripple off the wings of the flight of the manic brain. So that's like creates a ripple to the future, and other brains can like kind of slowly walk there too. And it could be that the manic brain flies and then comes all the way back to the beginning, but they've created those ripples so other brains can perhaps fly too. So one could also think of it in terms of a simulator, like a manic brain's gone further into the simulator, being able to simulate what one wants, or what's more congruent with how one was born versus how one was conditioned and programmed. And then all of a sudden, I don't even know if we fly back or the brakes are stepped on abruptly, and then, sometimes we're maybe depressed for months, and that could be the time that everyone is doing their patterns to catch up a little bit to where you landed. And I kind of think that that's possibly partly true. If I spend months in a room, then all the different complexities of the world are going on, and I might have just spent months going into dimensions of reality that aren't accessible to anyone. But by me going there, it's possible that those ripples create little paths for other people to be able to go there to some extent too. I think that could be possible. And that's why I feel that a lot of what needs to change, what I'm going to experiment with next, or what it seems I've been experimenting with in a way, is letting things change on the level of the brain and not so much worrying about action. Allowing the brain cells to speak from where it's been and what it's seen, but not necessarily trying to be like, hey everyone, let's go, like come this way. If you just come this way with me, like you'll see it, everything will be fine. People aren't necessarily going to see it, but I think each time one does that, if one creates words, those words create ripples in the field which other people can tune into too. Like imagine if somebody in mania sees something or has an insight come to mind, like a sentence or some words come to mind that have never been thought before. It's a new thought. It's from somewhere else. And if someone says it out loud, like I say it out loud to myself, it could be changing the field, and then other people think it too. And they don't know where it came from. I don't know where it came from. I don't know if that's true, but I just feel that being too excited and celebrating too much, like it's already there, is maybe not our role. Our role could be to accelerate and decelerate horizontally, and not necessarily to transcend and go into like enlightenment realms, because the acceleration into love shows us a lot, and the deceleration back into thought structures that might lead to anger and different not so great things can show us a lot too. Like I saw the subtle way that it wants to reattach the brain to the thinking reflex conglomerate that we've all been programmed with, and putting up a no to that while living in it could be just as powerful as going into future consciousness and almost living in the future in this wonderful heavenly realm that already exists here now. We just can't see because we're looking through thought structures. So back to a little bit more of what I read in the seizure stuff. One thing I read says that during their EEG training, this person learned that what they said was, when a nerve cell became irritated, it gave off an extra large burst of electricity. So they're talking about this in terms of seizures. And I don't know if this is still relevant today or what, but it's interesting, the wording, when a nerve cell became irritated. How does a nerve cell become irritated? That's like almost saying it has a human emotion or whatever. I think nerve cells could become irritated by trauma. Nerve cells could become irritated by the way the senses have been conditioned by thought. And it could be this burst of energy that creates that electrical energy. So a lot of people who have mental health diagnoses, they have some kind of trauma. And one could think, well, trauma could irritate the nerve cells or the brain cells or anything. They're irritated, that maybe they're irritated that that happened. Maybe they're irritated that this consensus world led to that. And so maybe when they're irritated, they give off a burst of energy, and this is part of what is able to energize the brain into a different state to see the world differently. So that the brain's not irritated. It's like it gets so irritated, it releases this energy, and then all of a sudden it's able to see all this meaning and perceive creatively instead of perceiving through thought. And it's interesting too, it said that seizures affect the senses like taste, touch, smell, sight, and sound. So, this burst of electricity that could possibly happen in so-called mania, for example, it could affect the senses. We could hear differently, we could see differently. It could be the burst of energy that affects the senses and makes our senses more sensitive. And another thing it said was that every seizure places enormous demands on the nutritional status of the body, leaving the person depleted of many nutrients. I can't remember where I read that exactly, I'm sorry, but what I'm trying to say is that I think that same thing could happen after a couple months of mania. it makes sense that that higher energy or electricity in the brain could also put demands on the nutritional status of the body, and that might be why the brain has to go back to objectivity, because having repetitive thoughts go through the brain is part of what lowers its energy, and it suppresses brain activity. It has an overemphasis on the prefrontal cortex and doesn't allow energy to go to other areas of the brain. So I think conditioned thought is almost the same as a tranquilizer. It tranquilizes us into believing that we're these separate selves, and we waste a lot of energy defending that. One other thing I didn't mention yet about the amino acids I was researching, somewhere I came across that glutamine is something that helps to make glutathione, which is a master antioxidant. But it also said that glutamine provides energy to neurons when blood sugar levels are low. So that could be important, because I think something that happens in so-called mania is that we use up a lot of our blood sugar energy. So at times we could be low on it, which could stress the neurons out, because perhaps they're trying to make new molecules and maybe even new genes, but don't have the energy for it. And it says that cabbage, raw and red, is a good source of glutamine. So I'll probably forget that, but there is some glutamine in this, which is good for now, I think. And something else to go with that is, since my energy's switched in the last couple weeks, I've been drinking so much water lately. And I've been going a little bit more, like quite a bit more. And I think what happens is my body starts detoxing, because when I'm in sort of the thought, history, objective mode, lower energy brain state, not much is happening in terms of thinking of new meanings and memes and things, which I think is part of the new function of that energetic state, and then decelerating to bring it back to, so-called objective consciousness. I think part of what happens is, in the sort of lower energy state, one is attracted to lower energy foods and like junk food and candy, and I haven't been as hungry. And I think part of what happens is that it's happened to me before. Usually when I go into a higher energy state, I lose weight. And I think it's because the body changes its metabolism. It probably goes into a ketosis without even having to avoid carbohydrates. And I think that would happen because the body needs the food that it's eating, plus it also just burns off all the fat to use it for energy for the brain in the form of ketone bodies. So I'll probably lose weight from being less hungry, and it could be partly too because the body is drawing on the stores that it stored up when it was in lower energy state and not able to process as much energy, burn off as much energy, and attracted to sort of lower energy foods. I think that's part of what happens. One time I was trying to eat. It's almost like the body preferentially eats up all that toxic stuff because I was eating really healthy, but it was just going right through me, and my body just kept eating its own fat. And I went down to 90 pounds. Right now I think I'm about 120, so I have about 10 pounds to donate to new machinations of the mind. And What else do I want to talk about? Steve Pavlina wrote an article years ago called List of Values, and it's at stevepavlina.com/list-of-values. And he was talking about what values align you with what you might want to do to earn income and blah blah. And I wrote down that people who are bipolar, we have an abundance of subjective meaning, creative perception, and that capacity. We might not have the whole abundance of subjective meaning in our memory, but we're able to have the capacity to create meaning subjectively in the moment. And then I wrote down that we need acceptance. So I was realizing that some of the values on his list are some of them that we need coming towards us. We might need different values coming towards us from others than the ones that we get connected with, that might be a totally different value system that we have when we're more in the objective consciousness of our conditioned thought growing up. So I wrote down a bunch of words, and of the list of values, quite a few of them, and I feel some of them are ones we might need to dampen down, and others we might need to grow into, and others we might have in mania but we don't necessarily have all the time. Maybe it's possible that if we are grounded in those higher states of love, maybe we would have these all the time. But in bipolar, it's quite well known that sometimes we go back into a consciousness where we can be angry or upset or things like that. And I did explain in another video that there could be a biological reason for this, like the monkey that was behind the one-way mirror, and he was trying to show that his dominance, which could be seen as the manic trying to communicate the meaning and the memes and the creative perceptions that they have, and people not responding to it because they can't see the value of it. And since it's not mirrored back, we get angry. Just like when the monkey was behind a one-way mirror, he could see his clan or whatever it's called, but the monkeys couldn't see him, so they couldn't respond submissively. And I'm not trying to say that people need to respond submissively to us. I think people need to respond in dialogue, and accept that we're trying to say something that could have some value. When that happens, that monkey loses, I think, serotonin or something, and then they become really agitated. So, their function is to be the alpha monkey, and the others know that. And when they can't see and respond because of the one-way mirror, the monkey gets really mad. So I think there's sort of a one-way mirror when we look at people in a psychiatric way. We're looking at them in order to objectify people who are in those states of consciousness, but we don't necessarily think, hey, they can help to subjectify us. We can help to subjectify others. And there's different values that need to come towards us, but some of the ones that I wrote down, sometimes we feel really altruistic, so altruism might be a value, but we might not have the means to be super altruistic. Oftentimes after a diagnosis, we're living in poverty, so that might be something that we can move towards. And then articulacy, I think we need to move towards this being a value of being able to articulate our subjectivity with each other and create that context and that type of paradigm and framework. Attentiveness, awareness, awe, beauty. We might need some bravery to be able to speak up. And naturally we have this bravery without thinking about it, or courage when we're in mania. We're very courageous. And calmness, we might need to work on that sometimes. bliss, we might need to reduce the bliss, and take stuff out of the pleasure circuits and put it somewhere else, and increase our capability and our capacity. We have a large capacitance of words that we haven't been able to share. And change, we're good at that. Community, we need more of that. So in those states I felt like, I need community, but I haven't necessarily been able to create that. So it could be of value, but it's not something that is an actuality. Compassion, having the ability to be compassionate as well as having it towards us. Connection, consciousness, contribution. We do want to make a contribution, I feel. Cooperation, creativity, curiosity, energy. Sometimes we have too much energy. Dreaming, like in terms of living our dreams. We might need to decrease the personal ecstasy and channel that energy somewhere else if it makes us behave in too much celebration. I feel we really need to educate ourselves about what's going on, and empathy, enjoyment, excellence, exploration. I added extrapolation, resonance, family, financial independence, fitness, flow, freedom, friendliness, friendship, fun, and generosity, giving, growth, guidance, happiness, harmony, health, heroism, honesty, humility, humor, influence, individuality, inquisitiveness, insightfulness, inspiration, intelligence, intensity, introspection, intuition, inventiveness, joy, kindness, learning, lightness, liveliness, love, making a difference, mastery, meaning, mindfulness, motivation. Our motivation is kind of our own subjective creative perception and not the driver of thought, which tells us what to be motivated about, which might be relatively meaningless. Mysteriousness, mystery, nature, non-conformity, open-mindedness, openness, organization, reorganize, consciousness, originality, outdoors, outlandishness, outrageousness. Sometimes we might need to decrease that, right? We might value it in certain states. Partnership, patience, passion, peace, perceptiveness, playfulness, power, practicality, presence, recreation instead of recreation, creativity, resilience, resourcefulness, responsibility, selflessness or less self, sharing, silence, silliness, simplicity, skillfulness, solitude, spirituality, spontaneity, stealth, strength, scaffolding. I put scaffolding there. Synergy, teaching, teamwork, transcendence, and truth, understanding, unflappability, uniqueness, vision, vitality, warm-heartedness, volunteering, wisdom, wonder. There were a lot more values on that from Steve Pavlina, and I just feel like some of these we need to increase and some of them we need to decrease. We need to be aware when certain of these come online and take precedence, and then when they sort of move out. And maybe we could even elaborate on some of these, like, hey, what visions did I have? What volunteering would I like to do? Who do I feel warm-heartedness towards? Or maybe I need warm-heartedness, and where can I get this in times that I need it? And what's my uniqueness? Things like that. So I wanted to share that for whatever reason, and I think that's all I'll talk about for now. Tomorrow I'm going to go downtown and meet up with someone who might give me something to try that I'll talk about after I try it. Maybe. And yeah, hopefully I have a good sleep. Talk later.